Hello everyone, and thank you again for coming today. When I first began this whole experience of creating my own show, I only knew that I wanted to include one thing: wings. At first, I likely couldn't tell you why wings specifically is what I wanted to have my thesis be about. I would have just told you that I found them pretty, and I wanted to create my own pair. But upon further reflection and many things from my childhood, I have found why I want wings. Since elementary school, I have been fascinated with myths. I wanted to learn so many myths, and they oftentimes had so many symbols that captured my attention. None of these myths held my attention for as long as the ones that included birds or really just winged beings. Birds and wings often held so much important roles in these stories that they were lessons to be learned. For example, Icarus had wings, but he was warned by his father that if he flew too high, the sun would melt off the wax from his wings. But if he flew too low, the sea would burden down his wings, so he could not fly. It is a warning for us to be careful lest we get burned, but also not to get drowned by our own pursuits. While having the While I love myths, I had also started to become more spiritual since coming to Hastings. This is because halfway through my first semester here, I had lost my maternal grandmother. She was often the one that took care of me after school as a child, and she herself was a very religious woman. Since her passing, I explored my spirituality. Specifically, I looked more into angels. I wanted to create my own guardian angel, and thus started to investigate more and more on how wings look and function. I researched how wings function anatomically, from bone structure to musculature to the very feathers. From that research, I found that feathers and bones are hollow. I also found that if wings were to be human size, they would have to be 22 feet in length. That is longer than from here to that wall. I wanted to create these large wings and replicate them as accurately as possible. At least I did at first. If I wanted to be completely accurate, ceramics would not have been the way to go. Clay is a very heavy material, the opposite of what wings are supposed to be. However, I have worked with ceramics for 6 years, and I am fairly familiar with its limits. I just need to figure out how to make them look lighter and get my sketches to become three-dimensional rather than two-dimensional. I started researching artists to see how they brought their ideas to life. Beth Kavanagh was one of the artists that I found that I connected to the most. Kavanagh would start with small maquettes of her ideas. Then she would work in sections of each of her giant sculptures. This inspired me to start creating my own pieces, being smaller first and gradually growing in size. At this point, I wasn't focused on just the wings. I was focused on the whole bird because I wanted people to acknowledge the space that they can take up. But once I started on the individual parts of the bird, I found I focused majorly on the feathers and the wings. My focus was less on the birds and having my ideas be viewed in the round and rather by the wings themselves. Wings have a way of displaying emotions and actions similar to hands or eyes. Depending on the positions, I can display happiness, sadness, fear, or even protection. I started playing with the different positions that I could do with a wooden base. I would then screw these feathers that I would come to create onto it, and once I determined that shape, I could get started. I also had to figure out what type of ceramic clay body I was going to use. This year I had the opportunity of working with a clay body called black basalt. Basalt ware clay is a type of stoneware that turns black once it is fired. This type of clay was made popular by British potter Josiah Wedgwood, the grandfather of the famous Charles Darwin. The other clay body that I decided upon was porcelain, which, when fired, turns white, the opposite of the black basalt. I rolled out a slab of clay and cut out feathers individually to put detail on. I would take a needle tool and individually be hashing out the texture of the feathers. This process took a long time to create even 10 feathers a day. I needed hundreds of feathers if I was going to have the wings I wanted to create. I took a chance and I made my own cookie cutters out of a pop can and some cardboard. But these cookie cutters helped me reduce the time that I needed to spend on each feather, and then I would take a small rolling pin and roll out the edges to make them thinner and appear lighter and create a little bit more texture than I did with the needle tool. With my process mostly figured out, I could then start the process of laying out my feathers layer by layer, starting with the longer flight feathers and then the smaller downy feathers. Each of the feathers have a hole in them, so I could drill into them onto the armatures that I made from earlier. This was my first successful pair of wings, and they were only about this big, so I began creating my own larger set, which didn't survive past the building phase. It was breaking the armature, so I wanted to try again. And this is the last time I tried making an actual armature for my wings. While I love this piece, I found that I'm not very good at woodworking and was very limited in what I could and couldn't do. I started to do research again on how other ceramic artists attach their work to walls. I found Courtney Madison and Natalie Blake, both ceramic mural artists. I found that they displayed their works directly onto the wall with either hangers, wires, or hanger holes. This restarted my method of wing making, but with everything being arranged, being placed directly onto the wall. These then became my largest set of wings, with the largest feathers being over 24 inches in length. This set is one half of my installation and is based off of the story of Michael and Lucifer. Michael and Lucifer were both archangels in heaven and considered one another brothers. That was until Lucifer defied their father and led a rebellion against him. Lucifer was sent to fight Michael to fight against someone he cared for. That part of the story is what most people are familiar with. But there was more to it that followed. Lucifer nearly brought Michael down with him. As I created this piece, I was inspired by this story and how it related to experiences I've seen from some of those that I was the closest to. I have seen them get almost dragged down by their closest relationships or what should have been those relationships, only to lift themselves back up by separating themselves from the bad characteristics that nearly destroyed them. After everything that happened, nothing is as it was. The falling out changed them. The ones who rose above the darker influences were still affected, changed by the events, and the same could be said to those that succumbed to their vices. Their wings no longer function as they once did. I was captivated by how this biblical story related to the human condition. Many people, including myself, could probably relate to this. Now, this may be a bit surprising, but I changed my method of wing making again. It seems after every set I make, I learn, adapt, and change what I'm doing. I explored my style and my methods were slowly evolving. In the final 2 wings I created, I wanted them to be flying around on the wall. For the first time, I stepped away from individual feathers and created full wings, but only in 2 parts. I wished to separate the wings from the feathers a bit. I cut them out of the same clay, but instead of using the cookie cutters, I instead draped them over a piece of paper, bunched up pieces of paper that were shaped like a wing. There were more feathers to be added to this installation, but they do not make up the main wings. Instead, I used a different fashion. Each of these individual feathers hold either good news or bad news. On the individual feathers, I wrote words that would be considered either something good that you would like to hear or something negative that you would really not want to hear. I am fairly certain everyone in this room has had to play the role of a messenger. Whether that is good news or bad news, the moments that people spend delivering these messages are also fleeting. Messengers and messages have almost always been associated with wings and birds. I'm sure everyone is familiar with Twitter and the little... There are examples of this in both reality and myths around the world. In Norse mythology, Odin is the ruler of the gods, but he is blind. As such, he has two ravens, Hugin and Munin. One is a white raven, the other is a black one, who bring him messages of the world around him, no matter if they were good or bad news. With that inspiration, I created these two sets of wings. One wing drops feathers of good news, the other of bad, negative words. Both wings fly together, since I'm sure we all have heard these words before at one point or another. Do you want the good news or the bad news first? I've enjoyed this last year of being creative and expanding upon my own views of beauty. From this whole experience, I have learned the importance of connecting from different sources of inquiry to have a better understanding of the world. My research into the anatomy of wings, feathers, and flight has helped me figure out the engineering processes that I would eventually go through for my wings. I've looked inwardly to find my personal experiences that can relate to others. My love of mythology and biblical stories and all of the things related to wings helped me to create a thesis that I am proud of. I want to thank you all for coming. I like to thank my family for helping me find my spiritual nature, my fellow thesis students who have given me so much advice on how to grow, and finally to my professors who helped me find my artistic path. Thank you all.
If you guys would direct your questions to Teeya now, that'd be appreciated.
Previous to people that have worked with clay, there's been a desire to take a break from all forms of clay. Are you similar to that, or?
Not really. I have very much been into clay since my junior year of high school, and the moment I could get into the studio here, I took every single ceramics class till there was none, and then I was like, I want to take more, and there's no more classes, so I don't think I'm going to give it up as easily.
When it comes to wings, what is it part that you're interested in the feathers themselves, or the fact that they can like fly and carry creatures, and then upon that, would you be interested in creatures with wings that aren't feathered, like bats?
I started exploring that more with the Lucifer set of wings. It is a mixture of feathered wings, since that's what he had as an angel, but as he fell, he became more bat-like, more demon-like. So I explored more bat wings. It's more just like the ability to fly rather than the feathers.
Since you used multiple different methods of making wings and feathers, is there one that you favor now that you've tried a lot that you would go back to?
I would probably be going back and revising all of them again and again. It's like a cycle. Like I've done puffed up things in ceramics before, but I've stepped away from that, and now I've come back to it again. It's more like a cycle that I would go, because I just like playing with the clay and getting my hands dirty.
So I love seeing all the shadows that were cast with different feathers on the wall.
Yeah.
Was that something that you had like planned going in, or like describe that process?
I was not exactly
exactly sure how the feathers would react when they were getting displayed with the lights on them until I got to my first one, and I loved the play of shadows. And I thought it was just so fun where the shadows looked even fluffier than my actual wings that I was creating. So, and it's always fun being surprised by those types of shadows.
So piggybacking on that question, do you think you can now, with that knowledge of the shadows, try off a bit more?
I might with more of like individual feathers falling from wings again. But with the puffed up ones, I find that the shadows are less important with those.
So you've like been focusing a lot on flight and feathers. Have you started thinking about what you might want to explore beyond this, other than like what motif you might want to look into?
I have not really thought too much about other motifs that I could explore. I will very much be continuing with more angels and wings in general, and the art that I get to do in my free time now. But eventually I wish to expand on other things.
Thank you very much.